So good afternoon in Scotland and the rest of the UK, and welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Alex Humphreys, and I will moderate today's discussion. Also from the Asia Scotland Institute is Roddy Gow, Chairman and Founder, and Rick Minchcombe, Director of Development. So the Economic Partnership Agreement between the UK and Japan has opened up areas for enhanced trade and collaboration. This agreement has gained increased interest due to the UK's application to the Comprehensive and Progressive Free Trade Agreement, or the Cptpp. This webinar will discuss aspects around the Cptpp and the future of UK-Japan and Scotland-Japan relationship. On our panel today is Sir David Warren, KCMG ORS. Sir David was previously British Ambassador to Japan in 2008 to 2012. After a career in British diplomatic service focused on East Asian affairs. He was made Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George in 2012 and received the honour of Grand Cordon Order of the Rising Sun in 2017. Sir David maintains a keen interest in Japan and East Asia, including as Chair of the Japan Society 2013 to 19 and Director of the UK-Japan 21st Century Group, a non-governmental organisation promoting greater understanding between the two countries. He is also a visiting professor at the School of East Asian Studies, University of Sheffield. Also on the panel, Professor Ian Gow, OBE, ORS. Professor Gow was Scotland's first professor of Japanese and founding director of the Scottish Centre of Japanese Study at Stirling University in the 1980s. He is an Edinburgh graduate and now honorary professor at his alma mater, where he still lectures. He is chairman of the Japan Society of Scotland and he has published extensively on Japanese defence and business management. He is a member of our International Advisory Council, and last year he was awarded Order of the Rising Sun for his contribution to British-Japanese studies and Japan-Scotland relations. Also on the call is Govinda Finn, an economics lecturer at Kobe University and sits on our International Advisory Council. He was former Japan and developed Asia economist at Aberdeen and was also involved in the Green Finance Initiative through his work on the board of Citi UK's Japan Market Advisory Group. Govinda graduated with an MA in Japanese Studies, majoring in the Asia-Pacific Economics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He completed a BA in Economics and History from Leeds University, which included a year at Dartmouth Business School, University of South Carolina. He holds an investment management certificate. Dr. Minako Morita Yeager has been intensively working in international trade policy across the globe for decades. Prior to her research work in academia from 2010, she has been involved in international trade as an economical affairs officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade Development in Geneva, a World Trade Organization service trade negotiator at the Japanese delegation to the International Organization in Geneva, and the principal trade policy analyst at the Japan Business Federation, Tokyo. She holds a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics, an MA in European Studies from the College of Europe in Belgium, an MA in International Law and Economics from the World Trade Institute in Switzerland, and a BA in Economics from Keio University in Japan. I'll now pass over to Roddy Gow to open things up. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. And we are very lucky to have such a powerful and clearly highly qualified panel today to look at this very interesting issue of the CPTPP and how the UK and Scotland can build relationships with Japan. I'd like to start off by asking Sir David if he could position this discussion drawing on his own knowledge of Japan and, of course, working on foreign policy and trade issues. Sir David.
Well, Roddy, thank you very much indeed. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. Thank you, Roddy, for this very kind invitation to speak to the Asia Scotland Institute's webinar on this very important subject. It's a pleasure to be back in contact with the Asia Scotland Institute again, and particularly to talk about trade with Japan. I welcome the emphasis that you're giving through this webinar to promoting trading links between Scotland and Japan, because it was much of my work as a diplomat over 30 years dealing with Japan, and I spent 3 postings in the British Embassy in Tokyo over that period, to promote trade links for Britain in Japan to help UK exporters. And a lot of my experience, not just as ambassador, which I was from 2008 to 2012, but as the commercial counselor in the embassy in the 1990s, and even when I was a very, very young diplomat back in the 1970s, was trying to get messages across to UK exporters that dispelled the myths about the impossibility of exporting to Japan. When I started this work back in the 70s, there were a lot of barriers. But by the time I was doing it full-time in the 1990s, most of those had come down. But the difficulty of working in this enormous, that time Japan was the 2nd largest economy of the world. Of course, China has overtaken it, but it is still multi-trillion-dollar yen market for world exports. The difficulties of working in this large, sophisticated, complex, but in essence accessible market couldn't be underestimated. But as so many British companies have found, and so many Scottish companies have found, there are ways through those cultural and bureaucratic difficulties to provide a powerful platform for prosperous trade development. And so it's good that we focus on that, and it's good that we focus on that in the context of the British government's work to cement a UK-Japan free trade agreement, the first such after we left the European Union, and essentially a continuation, marginal expansion, but basically a continuation of the EU-Japan free trade agreement, which formed an important part of my work as ambassador 10 years ago in encouraging the EU to force the pace of negotiations with Japan in the early stages against the wishes of some other major European countries. But we saw an opportunity, the UK government saw an opportunity, and we pushed very hard for negotiations to open, particularly in the wake of the traumatic effect of the tsunami and nuclear disaster at Fukushima 11 years ago, as a way of cementing solidarity with Japan. So we have the UK-Japan Free Trade Agreement, and now we have also the UK government's application to become a member of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the free trade arrangement between 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific, primarily, but not exclusively, Asian countries, and the UK's application to join, which it made early in 2021, is an important political statement and also potentially an economic initiative of some significance. I say political as well as economic, and perhaps one just has to position this in the context of the history of the Cptpp. This was originally intended as a free trade arrangement between the major developed and developing countries in the Asia-Pacific region: Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. When President Trump was elected in 2016, the US formally disengaged from any possible process of joining the agreement. That was a decision attributed to Trump, but in fact, it would almost certainly have happened had Hillary Clinton been elected president. And I think the first thing we need to do is to acknowledge the extraordinary success of the Japanese in salvaging, under Prime Minister Abe, in salvaging the Cptpp, with most of the rules still in place as the 11 countries formally initiated the partnership in 2018. This is a major trading bloc. It is something like 13% of the world economy, around 500 million people. This is an agreement which provides greater market access and a very high level, around 95% level of tariff elimination or reduction. And it's not a single market or a customs union, such as the European Union has become, but it nonetheless is an important economic area and increasingly likely to play a geopolitical role. Is it the benchmark for free trade agreements worldwide? And we're talking here in the absence of an effective multilateral trade liberalization process of the sort that the older ones among us remember from the days of GATT and the World Trade Organization's trade round? Probably not. It has high standards in certain areas, such as the management of state-owned enterprises and the provision of data. Unsurprisingly, it has much lower standards in areas that are of great importance to us in terms of services and removing non-tariff as opposed to tariff barriers. Nonetheless, this is an important trade arrangement, and the UK's application to join in the beginning of 2021 has already begun the process of attracting other countries to express interest in becoming part of the CPTPP. Prominently, of course, China, which formally applied to join late last year, and Taiwan, which, if it is able to join, will have to join with some complex terminology around it, because of course of the tensions between China and Taiwan in terms of sovereignty, as well as Ecuador. And there are other Asian countries which have also expressed an interest in joining, although whether or not they are going to action those, I'm thinking of South Korea and Thailand, we wait to see. The implications of China joining, of course, are well beyond maybe the remit of this webinar. They would be really complicated, and at a time when there is firstly such geopolitical concern about China, such concern about its human rights, and its persecution of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and its elimination of democratic activity in Hong Kong, quite apart from the tensions with Taiwan, and the clampdown on the technology sector. It's hard to see how China is going to become a very comfortable trading partner or negotiator within the context of the CPTPP, but we'll see how that develops. From Britain's point of view, applying to join is an important statement of commitment to developing a complex web of free trade agreements and arrangements with its major trading partners in the wake of its decision to leave the European Union. I do think we have to make the point, and I don't want to be too political about it in this webinar, but we have to make the point that it can't be a substitute for a trading relationship with the European Union. Around 8% of our exports go to the countries of the CPTPP, over 40% of our exports go to Europe. And if we're talking about our trade and investment relationship with Japan, we must remember that Japan, Japanese government and Japanese companies attach enormous importance to our retaining as far as possible the sort of seamless relationship, economic relationship with Europe that we enjoyed as members of the EU, not least for the major Japanese companies who have invested in the UK and depend upon those trading links not being broken to ensure that their business plans are realized. So we must look with skepticism at some of those politicians who argue that, in a way, trading with Japan and the other countries of the CPTPP is going to be a substitute for whatever problems arise in Europe. They will not be. But that doesn't mean that Japan won't remain an important market for British goods and services, and a much wider range of British goods and services than maybe people understand in the popular imagination. The old myths about trading with Japan are that it's basically Scotch whiskey and woolens. And of course, I was delighted as commercial attaché and ambassador to do a tremendous amount of promotion of those important products in the embassy. But the reality is that the breadth and range of goods and services which we sell to Japan is much wider than people realize. The sophistication and appreciation of the Japanese market for what British companies can provide is very wide. The long-standing relationships which the strongest exporters have developed over decades are still there. And there are real opportunities for British companies, and I'm talking here about Scottish companies, to take advantage of the new arrangements which have been created. And the last point I want to make is a little bit of a commercial, and that is to say that I hope that those companies that want to take advantage of those arrangements will do so through the work of the British Embassy in Tokyo and our Consulate General in Osaka, which retain very high quality commercial staff, very experienced commercial staff, who are able to put companies in direct contact with potential customers, agents and representatives, and help them develop their business plans in the Japanese market so that Japan can indeed be, as the title of the webinar suggests, a gateway for Scottish trade. Roddy, thank you very much indeed. And I'm looking forward to hearing about this important subject from some real economic experts who will be talking this morning.
David, thank you. So thank you very much for that extremely helpful overview. And now let me pass it to my namesake, Ian Gow.
Thank you, Roddy, and I'm delighted to be able to participate. After more than a decade in England and Japan, I came back to Scotland in the mid-1980s. The hunger for information, skills on Japan was palpable. It was amazing. It was an amazing time for Scotland. Major inward investment, funding for Scottish universities for teaching, and so on and so forth. And with not only a great trading nation, but actually by the end of the 1980s, a major science and technology country as well. Moving from pursuer to pioneer, if you like, in that sense. After more than a decade in China, coming back in 2014, there was this same fever of hunger for information, but it was about China, and it's quite amazing. 5 Confucius Institutes, more per capita possibly than any other country in the world. Funding from the Scottish government for language studies in schools. And this whole development dwarfed anything that we'd managed to do on Japan in the 1980s. There are now 2 universities offering Chinese degrees in Scotland, Edinburgh and St Andrews, and the Japanese degrees, it's dropped down to 1. Sterling has dropped out, and the flag is being carried ever so well by Edinburgh. Glasgow, of course, also has a virtual China research centre, and of course, ASI is producing some very interesting stuff on Japan. But there was also a major number of series of seminars on BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. We don't hear much about it, and there has been a change in the mood music over the last 3 or 4 years. And of course, it's vitally important to build up awareness and understanding whether we wish to compete, collaborate, or contain China globally, but especially in the Indo-Pacific and East Asian region. But we have to remind people again that there is another Asian giant, one that's having ever closer relations with us. And that, of course, is what I would consider to be almost a revived Japan, both in terms of its taking over leadership, as Sir David mentioned, the impossible, building up your defense and expanding it outwards, and at the same time leading trade in the regions, in the Asia-Pacific region, and filling that gap as America withdrew from essentially an effort to have a rules-based organization in this region, the Asia-Pacific. Because there were 3 major developments, that's what's colored the 3 talks we're giving. There's what Sir David mentioned about the free trade agreement and the economic partnership agreement with Japan, and also the discussions about the membership of the China-Pacific Partnership. I can't speak this, I find it difficult to talk about this acronym very easily. A second one was a report of very encouraging progress on Japan, Scotland, Japan-UK collaboration in science and technology, as Japan is gearing up again. It's faded a little bit over the years after the 1990s and so on, but it's now building up again to move itself back up into the leading science and technology nations. And the other, of course, is the deeper, the encouraging developments for a deeper relationship between the UK and Japan in defense and security, particularly in that region. And the idea was to link all of this with raising an awareness in Scotland, and that's why we're collaborating with the Japan Society, the Asia Scotland Institute, and indeed the Scottish Parliament's all-party group on Japan. We are heading all three of the seminars. On Japan and Scotland, doing business between Japan and Scotland, it is of course obligatory to mention Thomas Glover. But I have news for all those people who depend on that. There were three businessmen in Japan, doing business in Japan in 1619. One of whom earned enough money to fund a chair in Aberdeen, one who gave his estate to the Trinity House Home for Mariners in Leith, and a third one who fathered the first Japanese-Scottish chaplain. These were all working for the East India Company. In 1619, King James, in his capacity as King of Scotland, on his only visit back to Scotland, created the Scottish East India Company, which probably would never have got near Japan, but it might have gone to the Spice Islands because Japan didn't really have a good enough market. But he, by letters patent under Scottish law, created the Scottish East India Company. It was, however, quickly closed down by Scottish and English business interests in London, persuading the king, I won't say how they persuaded him, to drop that, to withdraw it. Now, I had a look through, because I was asked to speak particularly on Scotland, first of all, I had a look at some documents about trading with Japan. And in the priority of trade, particularly exports, Japan is in the second priority, according to government plans. It's 16th. And on China, China's in the first priority, it's 9th. Now, obviously, the new agreements will actually help a lot more with Scotland. And although there's still a tendency for even the government to spend too much time talking about iconic Scottish goods, if I might call it that, there are some very important signs of the importance of other areas, as Sir David so eloquently pointed out. So obviously we need to think a lot more about Japan, but what about the Cptpp and the partnership? Well, there is a document from the Scottish government. It's very negative. It's not necessarily negative about this organization. It is negative about why we should join it. And some of what it says is interesting. Some of it is colored, shall we say, by anti-Brexit. Some of it is about lack of consultation by the UK government on joining the Cptpp. But there are some very interesting things that it points out. It says there was a lack of consultation with the developing administrations, with the devolved administrations, Scotland and Wales. They found it difficult to understand, and you can understand from a Scottish point of view and Brexit and so on, why would the UK government free itself from the constraints of the EC and then dive into another kind of trade grouping where it had very little ability to change the rules of the game? And it says, in a faraway place. Now, this is not indicating in any way an understanding of how important, in every sense of the word, the Indo-Pacific region is for the future. Why join an agreement when you already have free trade agreements and possibly even economic agreements with 9 of the 11 partners in this particular grouping? It does point out, as Sir David has rightly pointed out, that it is in no way a replacement for business in Europe, particularly for Scotland. So there are some Scottish, I'll give you a couple of very positive signs. There's a new Sapphire program for higher education, which is offering small grants, £5,000–10,000, possibly £15,000, for collaboration, research on collaboration with countries in Asia, including Japan, but it is one of many countries and there's a very limited amount of funding there. But perhaps the real one, and it emphasizes what Sir David was saying about the other areas, is the new subsea consortium, funded by Scottish Enterprise, partly funded by Scottish Enterprise, and the Nippon Foundation in private, 21 million of funding for companies and universities to research and develop collaboration with the Japanese subsea industry. And that's a very, very positive thing. But it seems to me that, it's a simplistic argument in one sense, Japan shouldn't be regarded by Scotland simply as a very low priority market where they might make some improvement. Japan, of course, is a major partner in trade, technology and defense in Asia Pacific, but I would like to think about the possibility of more development by Scotland in Japan as a base for moving into this region. We may never get, or we never in the end want, full membership if we not agree with some of the things and we can't change them. Japan has a rising reputation in the region now. It has leadership of the free and open trade rules-based grouping within the Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific. It has a tremendous knowledge of the region. Japan's businesses have a highly complex know-how from operating, a high know-how from operating complex production systems and supply chains across the Cptpp, and there are 4 others trying to join. Although, to be honest with you, I'm rather concerned about the overlap between this and the RCEP, the regional one, which has China in, and it may well give a second wind to the BRI. That one may have been created by ASEAN, but the leadership is probably going to go to China. Whereas with the Cptpp, well, the Biden administration has made it clear, reference what we heard before about what might have happened if the Democrats had won under Trump, is they say they have no intention of joining it. They want to go up with a new organization. That's just very recently. So we have a Japan which is gearing up in science and technology after losing momentum, a major expansion of military commitment, power and power projection. So for me, this is Japan is back, and we are very lucky in that we have a close relationship with Japan, and it's got even closer in the last year or so with these new developments. The only regular mention of Japan in the Scottish press and the Scottish media at the moment is the import of some made in Japan products. Japanese footballers for Glasgow Celtic, 4 of them for the first team. But what we really need to see a lot more in the Scottish media and in thinking around Scotland in both the public and private sector is a raised awareness of Japan as it is now, and a raised awareness of what it might be able to do to help Scotland focus on and participate more in the Indo-Pacific region. We need a strategic analysis of the potential for Scotland as Japan relationship deepens. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I think we're asking Govinda and then Minako to make some comments before we try and engage with the participants who are following the webinar. So thanks, Ian, for that very much. Govinda.
Many thanks, Roddy, for the introduction and for the opportunity today. You can see by my surroundings that it is 9:30 in the evening here in Japan, which is a useful reminder for me to thank those of you who are based in Japan for choosing to spend your Friday evening with us. So my job today is to quantify the impact of the foundational change in Asian trade relationships, summarized so well by Sir David, on the economy, and perhaps more importantly, to trigger some thoughts about how this will impact businesses and jobs in Scotland and Japan. So I'll begin with a story. So 10 years ago, an Australian economist walked into our office in St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh with a model and a $1.9 trillion promise. That man was Professor Cptpp, and his model predicted that a regional free trade deal based on both the TPP and the RCEP agreement, which we've already discussed, and that included China and the US, would raise incomes globally by nearly $2 trillion. Unfortunately for Peter, he had only a limited audience that day. Actually, I was the only other person in the room, which does say something about how the sheen had come off trade agreements 10 years ago and the WTO Doha round deadlock, and also about the prospects of a revival in free trade led or grouped around China and Japan. Undeterred, Professor Petrie published a paper in 2012, and he found the US State Department was definitely listening. In fact, this model became the primary workhorse for calculating the economic benefits of the TPP. And it's still used today. Professor Petrie updated his estimates last year. In comparison to his earlier estimates, the benefits of a trade agreement, a regional trade agreement ex-US, are now estimated at a still substantial $380 billion. Crucially, though, these are nearly completely offset by the losses generated by a prolonged US-China trade war. So as David mentioned, the stakes here are incredibly high. Okay, I'm going to pause there. And the reason is I was asked to speak to a group, a Japanese tech firm that was working on a market strategy, a go-to-market strategy for the UK recently. And I noticed when I started to speak about Cptpp, the eyes glazed over. And obviously, I want to avoid that happening today. And the CMO of this company gave me some advice. And she kindly explained that trade agreements are too complicated to navigate to be considered a genuine business opportunity for SMEs. So I asked her, well, what constitutes a business opportunity? And she said, the opportunities exist in areas where Japanese firms can really differentiate themselves from the rest of the world. So with my final comment, or the final time I have, I want to try and bring to life the opportunities for businesses by discussing 4 sectors where Japan is an outlier versus global norms. And I'm going to put them into 2 camps: Japan as a laggard and Japan as a leader. So let's start with the laggards. The energy sector, specifically the offshore wind power. And secondly, IT services. So frankly, Japan's wind power generation strategy has been a failure. The 3 floating offshore wind national projects, the first of which began in 2012, 2 of them have been based in the Kyushu region, have struggled because of high costs and technical issues, which means that today wind contributes less than 1% of total power generation in Japan. That compares to 50% in Scotland. The good news is things are changing. Last October, the government approved a new strategic energy plan in the aftermath of Japan agreeing a 2050 net zero target, and is working on a clean energy strategy to be published this summer. Japan obviously does have strength in the supply chain, and the big boys such as Toshiba and Mitsubishi are waking up to the opportunities. However, they have been slow to start. And this creates opportunities for Scottish supply chain firms, especially those ones with niche products that are able to integrate into the Japanese supply chain. A second area Japan has been a laggard compared to its international peers is in IT services trade. Actually, we'll hear more from Professor Marita Jaeger later, but trade in digital services has been hindered in general by a fierce battle for leadership over the formation of rules for digital trade. Cptpp promises to rewrite the rules here again, but it's unlikely to see global harmonization for some time yet. Again, this is a sector where there's much room for improvement. Okay, so enough on the laggards. How about the leaders? Well, how can we see the trailblazers? It may not be a surprise to some of you that financial services sector trade between Japan and Scotland is worth about 3 times IT services. Scotland has a long and distinguished history in banking, and in the pensions and investment space, we've seen a string of alliance and acquisition activities. For example, Mitsubishi Trust buying First State Investments and also Stewart Investors, which is again based in St Andrews Square in Edinburgh. In fintech too, engagement with Japan has been surprisingly advanced, with the Fintech Association of Japan and Fintech Scotland signing an MOU in 2020. So really quite a lot of activity in financial services and some really quite strong relationships there. Last but not least, especially given the lateness of the hour on a Friday night, is the drink and food sector, or should I say the food? I said the drink and food. Actually, I meant the food and drink, but obviously my mind's already more focused on drink. Anyways, food and drink exports to Japan are worth a lot. It's £100 million a year, and they are a key part of the trade relationship. Alcoholic beverages make up about 70% of the total, while seafood accounts for another significant chunk. Again, Cptpp will change the nature of the relationship somewhat, and will extend the coverage already found in the existing CEPA arrangements. But it will also address some of the regulatory barriers that also affect the sector. This has a meaningful impact on businesses for firms such as the Scottish Salmon Company, which exports to Japanese sushi chain Gaten Sushi. So to summarize everything I've covered, firstly, the big picture matters. 99.9% of UK exports will become eligible for tariff-free trade with Cptpp members. Secondly, Japan has some genuine differentiators that makes it an ideal partner for Scottish businesses. There is leadership in finance and food and drink, and growth opportunities in renewables and digital trade. So to put it simply, the UK membership of TPCPP can make a difference to Scottish businesses and jobs. And I should point out that these are not the only sectors. Obviously, there are other sectors. Before we came on, Sir David mentioned he'd taken up a role with the Nursing and Midwifery Council of the UK. And really, I should be mentioning healthcare as well, which is another key sector for UK and Japan trade. But we could go on for a long time. I think the main point is there are some real core sectors for us to start thinking about the business implications. So that's enough for me. I'll hand it back over to Roddy, and I look forward to questions later on.
Govinda, thank you very much. And please feel free to pour yourself a drink at this late hour. We won't mind. Professor Morita, thank you for being with us. And if you'd like to unmute yourself, we would love to hear from you for 5 minutes or so before we open up the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Roddy. I a little bit envy Govinda. That's you're already, ready for that drinking Friday night, and then we still have 9 hours to read that point. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting seminar. Because of the extinguish, the panelists already covered so many issues. Let me just, as my opening remarks, I'd like to focus on what the UK, Japan, CEPA, and the Cptpp means for the UK, Japan economic cooperation and beyond from the trade policy perspective. From the policy perspective, clearly the UK, Japan, CEPA plays a role as a strong foundation of enhancing strategic alliance in international trade and beyond. The Japanese government did everything they could to create the UK-Japan CEPA, and the bond between the UK-Japanese government was strengthened through these negotiations. Now the UK is on the process of joining the Cptpp. For the UK, joining the Cptpp is a part of its historical, geopolitical geostrategic project, in the Pacific tilt. So which encompasses not only economic strategy, but also geopolitical security and promoting values of free trade and democracy. And for Japan, as Ambassador Warren rightly explained, the Cptpp is important from geopolitical strategy perspective. Having been exposed to economic and political challenges posed by China, just next door of Japan, it is very important for Japan to ensure a rules-based, market-oriented trade environment in the Asia-Pacific. So as a U.S. tactic of creating TPP was cementing the U.S. presence in the Asia-Pacific by promoting high-level market-led rules. This is very different from the outset, and promote free trade and democracy in Asia-Pacific. So Japan expects that Cptpp play that role even without the US. So in this regard, for Japan, the UK, the country which has been a front runner of free trade, market economy, and democracy, is exactly the right partner, and then to become a new first member of the Cptpp. So interestingly, the UK is joining the Cptpp will change the nature of the Cptpp from the mere regional trade club to the like-minded middle power club that promote, rules-based trading system. So this is a really critical issue for Japan. Also, we should not forget the role of the Cptpp as a rule setter. Japan would like to use the Cptpp as a model of creating multilateral trading rules at the WTO. One example is digital trade rules. In fact, the e-commerce discussion currently taking place at the WTO as a part of joint statement initiatives. Japan, together with its allies such as Singapore and Australia, are proposing the core principles of digital trade rules derived from the Cptpp rules. So if the UK joins the Cptpp, this kind of like-minded group can be enhanced, within this group of the Cptpp. From the policy perspective, I'd like to emphasize the role of the UK-Japan CEPA and the Cptpp as a solid foundation of UK-Japan strategic alliance beyond the bilateral and the plurilateral levels once the UK joined the Cptpp. So the UK and Japan can strategically enhance cooperation in global trade as a middle power alliance that share values of 21st century trade and world economy. So I think that middle power strategic alliance is becoming very important than ever for several reasons. The first reason is that the post-war global economic order has shaped relationships between the United States and Asia and underpinned the prosperity and the security of Asia. But David and Ian already said, the hegemonic battle between the US and China is putting the prosperity in the region under strain. The second reason is a lack of US leadership in the international trade. Because of the Biden administration America First policy, we can't expect US leadership in the global trading system for coming years. So while the WTO reforms are going on, many countries continue to use FTAs to respond to dynamic political economic changes around international trade. Because UK and Japan shares interest in the WTO reforms on the one hand, and having bilateral and trilateral alliance on the other hand, once the UK joined the Cptpp, so the two countries can fill a gap to shape 21st century global system by forming this middle power strategic alliance. The third is about collaboration for promoting common values of 21st century trade. In addition to rules-based trading system, open economy, democracy, the values such as human rights and environment protection are becoming core values of 21st centuries. So especially promoting climate change and sustainable development is in its socioeconomic system is crucial for 21st century. So there are many business opportunities arising from sustainable development goals, such as energy efficiency, green energy, and eco-friendly products and services. So UK and Japanese companies can collaborate to create synergy in innovation and technology in this area. So the cooperation between the UK and Japanese government in the area of climate change and sustainable development will become the key in this 21st century trade policy. So next, I'd like to talk about what the UK-Japan SEPA and the Cptpp means for business. Japan and the UK has been strong economic ties for decades, even before the EU-Japan EPA entered into force in 2019 and was succeeded by the UK-Japan SEPA from last January. As you know, the UK-Japan SEPA is sort of replica of the EU-Japan EPA, except for the digital trade chapter and some progress in regulatory cooperation in the financial sector. So from the economic studies, including the one done by the UK government, its economic long-term economic impact seems to be very slim. So since it is still 1 year since the SEPA entered into force and the business have been exposed to uncertainty caused by COVID-19 and fragile UK-EU trade relations, it is very difficult to evaluate how the SEPA functions in practice. So we need to, do the proper evaluation in due course. So however, I observed that the UK-Japan SEPA clearly visualized the policy framework to support business between the UK and Japan. So since the UK and Japan SEPA entered into force, the UK business just started aware of the presence of the FTA. So in Scotland, employees of SMEs account for more than 40%, and SMEs turnover accounts for almost 40% of its economy. So living in a digitalized economy, the role of SMEs are becoming more important in creating dynamism in the economy. So this tells the role of the UK-Japan SEPA is to internationalize these SMEs and facilitate their trade investment activities in Asia Pacific. Then I can see, since the SEPA was entered into force, the networking opportunities, there are so many networking opportunities, both at business and government levels. this is very good for business, especially for SMEs who need a kind of network, extended network. And then here comes the UK joining CPTPP. So the main benefit of the CPTPP is that it offers unified rules that apply to all members. So that, the currently, but on the other hand, as David well explained, the CPTP cannot be a substitute of the trade versus the EU UK. So this is completely true. I must say that very the sad evidence, but that already the UK is already having the preferential trade agreement with the 7 countries among the CPTP countries. That those are Canada, Chile, Japan, Mexico, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, out of 11. And then Australia, UK is now signed, and the New Zealand, UK is coming and following. And that means 9 countries, the UK will have the bilateral preferential relationship. So that when it comes to join the CPTPP, only Malaysia and Brunei are the countries that do not have the bilateral relation with the bilateral preferential trade agreement with the UK. And I just would like to recall that for the UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, Singapore are major 4 trade partners. So 87% of services and 80% of goods export, and 84% of services imports, and 75% of goods imports are dominated by these 4 countries. So the economic limit is limited. But on the other hand, the benefit is, as I said, this bilateral trade agreement creating the divergence of rules, and then creating sort of what we call the spaghetti ball situation. So as Govinda said, especially for SMEs, it's so difficult to just use existing bilateral FTAs because it's too complicated, and then especially the global supply chain. How they can use the existing rule is they really need the human resources for that. So that so this is why that we need to just more facilitate business to just engage in the using the FTA's the current framework. So I just would like to stop here because we don't have so much time left.
Thank you, Professor, very much indeed. I see we've got, I think it's 4 or 5 questions there. Martin Barrow, we ought to start off with. Alex, so it's over to you, just to pull those up, can you?
Thank you, Roddy, and thank you for everyone. I'll try and get through as many as I can. So thank you, Martin Barrow. It seems more of a statement than a question, but he's asking what more can the UK and Japan do to work together in rebuilding tourism in both directions? In his opinion, it's teamwork, engagement, collaboration, and harmony. Would anyone like to add to that at all as to further collaboration within the tourism industry?
Ian, would you like to take that? Would you like to answer Martin's question?
Sorry, who?
Martin Barrow, who you will know, of course.
Mm-hmm.
He's with Jardine Matheson Group and was involved with Malaysian Airlines. You'll see it in the Q&A function, his question.
Well, leaving aside what's going to be left of tourism because of COVID, the truth of the matter is that I think that the greater awareness of for tourism to Japan, the greater awareness of how important a country Japan is, the more likely you are to increase people wanting to visit Japan. That's obvious. And as I say, I think that generating more interest, generating more interest in schools and in FE colleges and universities will get more people interested, but tourism itself is not essentially focused on people who want to learn a phenomenal amount more about Japan than the beauties that it already has. So it's a very difficult question to answer.
Okay. Thank you. And I wonder if David, Sir David, you'd like to answer the question from Ken Sutherland, who runs Canon Medical in Scotland. He just says, I can see how Scotland needs Japan for trade, but does Japan feel the same way? Govinda has identified some opportunities, but will Japan look to Scotland for expertise in these areas, or do we need to do much more to promote Scotland in Japan? So David.
I'm happy to, Roddy. And that's a great question from Ken. I think the answer is probably yes. But we should remember that we will be promoting Scotland from a reasonably high base in terms of Japanese understanding of the Scottish brand identity, if I can use the marketing language, probably than, dare I say, all other parts of the United Kingdom. When I was ambassador, we had very, very strong representation in Tokyo from all parts of the UK, not just the devolved administrations, but the various 9 English regions, in terms of attracting investment and to a certain degree promoting trade, although trade promotion was something which we did really as United Kingdom rather than individual regions. And it's fair to say that inevitably Japanese in commercial and public kind of understanding and awareness of the different parts of the UK will be variable. Scotland has a very strong brand image. Sometimes that's for the sort of traditional marketing, trading reasons that we all understand, and some of the products we've talked about in today's webinar. It's also a respect for Scottish education, Scottish technical expertise, the traditional links with Scotland, which Ian referred to. There are various reasons. So Scotland has an identity in the Japanese commercial mind, but I think Ken is absolutely right. It is necessary to promote Scotland as actively as possible. And I remember when I was ambassador, welcoming John Swinney on a very successful trip to Japan, and other members of the Scottish administration as well have visited since. This is an important element in the armory of getting the message across.
Thank you. Alex, would you like to slip in Martin Allen's question? And then there's the one from Fraser Newham.
Yeah, thank you, Brodie. So from Martin Allen, he was looking for your opinion of if the Scottish government is exercising economic maturity with their comments, or do they simply not have the devolved power to join the Cptpp on their own? So Govinda or Ian, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's sort of more just political rhetoric from them, or immaturity?
So very, very quickly, Ian, do you mind if I'll answer first and then pass it over very quickly? So I think there is the footprint of UK trade and Scottish trade is somewhat different with Cptpp partners. The main differences are on the food and drinks sector, which is a much bigger sector for Scotland, and also the transport equipment and chemical sectors are actually significantly smaller than the other sectors. So there are the footprint is different, so there should be some considerations for the shape of the economies. That said, I think if you're talking about the magnitude of obviously the 11 countries in the Cptpp agreement and the scale of the free trade agreement, then the magnitudes, those differences between the UK and the Scottish company kind of become quite insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But obviously, it is worthwhile putting forward the priorities of Scotland and the Scottish government.
Thanks. Ian, you're muted. You are on mute. Still on mute. No?
Am I okay now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult to say, I mean, the Scottish government or the Scottish government and the Scottish enterprise and so on and so forth. Clearly, it doesn't help, although I can understand it, that Scotland is particularly miffed about any threats to its European markets, difficulties that arise from Brexit, etc. And I think if you're dealing with Japanese companies from Scotland, we are where we are with Brexit. It's very unlikely to go back. It's got to be made to work better. So bitching is perhaps too strong a word, moaning about the fact that, you know, we obviously don't, the Scottish thinkers obviously don't accept that the Asia-Pacific region is a substitute. But equally, the more they talk about the difficulties of Brexit, the more difficult it is for strategic planners in Japan to think of us as a base, because it can't be just a base for Scotland. It has to be a base into Europe. So I think that there's a more parochial view of what we need to do is to make sure we've got the European market nailed down. The priority countries are actually mostly EC countries. So, you know, I think that in the end, I should have to say that the document I was quoting from was about signing this agreement. And what they did was then to raise all these issues about having a go at the UK government for what it was doing. So, but there are people who are seriously thinking about where we can go internationally. But I honestly think that referring to the Asia-Pacific region, such a strategic region for global R&D, for global trade, and for defense issues, to talk about this as a faraway land we shouldn't be thinking like that, especially since Scots, by tradition, have, of course, created one of the largest diasporas in the world of people going out and doing business in these regions. So, no, there's a mixture. There are some very good developments. And for example, one of the areas where I think Japan and Scotland, it'll feature in the third lecture on S&T, is there's tremendous enthusiasm about collaboration between Japan and Scotland in climate change research. Definitely. And we've seen it with the subsea, that if they get their act together, it can really work. So, as I say, that document was probably overladen with anti-Brexit and lack of consultation by the UK government with the devolved administrations, in, of course, an area that the devolved administrations have actually got no power. And that's the other issue, is Scotland has a brand, but in the end, it's a bit like in the past with Japan. There was a conflict between regional governments in Scotland trying to deal with Japan, and Scottish enterprise saying, no, you should come through us. You know, that it reflects some aspects of Scotland's relationship, Scottish government's relationship with the UK government. But from what I've heard, clearly, from what I've been hearing and so on, clearly there are major benefits, but we need to get Scotland thinking far more about it, and it possibly should be through Japanese eyes. I should say, by the way, that one of the areas where there may be a conflict between Japan and Scotland, a possible conflict, is between Japan and the UK, never mind just Scotland, is that for all the changes that have been made in the Japanese defense posture, one of the things that's just changed is that Japan is now free to export defense technology, defense products to a region which everybody is building up the military forces. Now, the UK has defense interests in this area. And again, I think they need to try and work possibly with the Japanese so that the Japanese don't take our market in that region, but we have to work together with them.
Ian, thank you. We are very nearly out of time. I want to know if Professor Morita Yega would like to say anything in conclusion. Is there anything you'd like to add? You are on mute.
Yeah, well, it's not cannot be the conclusion, but I think it's well the area of the the economic area of the UK's the gateway, using the Japan as a gateway to the Asia Pacific.
Yes.
Is maybe the because competitive the UK is services economy, and then so the while Japan has established regional supply chain in the Asia Pacific, and then especially post COVID, and then they try to establish this resilient supply chain in the region. And even during the COVID, it's investment and trade is been increasing in the. So this is very strong, in showing that there is an opportunity, and especially what I mean is the services sector. We said in trade experts said more before, but input of services exports to Japan's international supply chain in that area. It's really the kind of area of the opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So David, did you want to make a comment at the very end of this session before we close it out?
Well, I don't have any profound additional thoughts to offer, Roddy, other than just to echo what Ian has been saying at different times in the webinar about the importance of science and technology and the importance of innovation. I should probably have mentioned that when I talked about the promotional effort that is needed. That it's such an important underpinning principle of the trade and investment relationship that we will be forging with Japan in the future. This sense of two science and innovation powers working more closely together. And just to touch briefly on one point which we haven't picked up from the Q&A about whether Japan or Southeast Asia would be the gateway to this region. It's important to remember just how massive the Japanese economy is in comparison with any of the other economies in the Cptpp, in the absence of China. Japan will remain an economic giant, and I use the word giant. It may not be the second largest economy in the world any longer. It's number 3, and its position vis-a-vis India and Indonesia, I think in the longer term, will slip. But in 30 years' time, it will still be in the top 5 of the world economies. And we have to remember just how powerful an economy Japan will be and how much of a powerhouse in terms of science and innovation it is likely to remain. We have to have a proper sense of perspective.
David, thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the panelists. We've gone over our time limit. We haven't been given a red or yellow card yet, but we will soon. So thank you all, Professor Marika Jaeger, particularly you from Sussex and from your home, for all your very helpful input on the Cptpp. Ian, for your unique view of from Scotland of all the opportunities and challenges. We haven't dealt with the issue properly of education yet, which was a question asked, what more can we do to broaden the education connections with Japan? Govinda, the man of the night, in the sense that it is the night with you, thank you so much for your participation. And Sir David, again, for yours, and Alex for managing things so well. So to all of you, from the Asia Scotland Institute, for whom better understanding the different countries and cultures of Asia is a critical component to equipping tomorrow's leaders in Scotland, Scotsmen and women, who, like their forebears, we hope will be encouraged to go forth and do good and do business in Pan-Asia. To all of you, thank you very much.